I am Imani, 28 years old, and I spent my entire life being treated as the financial burden of my wealthy Atlanta family. At my graduation dinner, my brother-in-law smirked and tossed a $2,000 steakhouse bill into my lap, loudly declaring it was time I paid my own way. The whole table laughed until my grandfather smiled at me and said he was glad the $5,000 he sent me every single month was helping. When I looked him in the eye and told him I had never received a single dime, the dead silence that followed shattered my family's perfect facade forever. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to toxic relatives who underestimated your worth. The private dining room at the elite Buckhead Steakhouse smelled of roasted garlic, expensive leather, and old money. This dinner was supposed to be a celebration of my newly earned master's degree in financial forensics. Instead, it felt like another staging ground for my family's favorite pastime, ignoring my existence while worshiping my older sister, Gabrielle. Gabrielle sat across from me, adjusting her diamond tennis bracelet and laughing loudly at a joke made by her husband, Trent. Trent was a 34-year-old investment banker with a terrifyingly arrogant streak and a habit of looking down his nose at anyone who did not share his tax bracket. My parents, Yvonne and Desmond, hung on to his every word. They loved Trent. He was the wealthy white son-in-law who elevated their social standing in the competitive Atlanta elite circles. They treated him like royalty while treating me like the embarrassing help. My father, Desmond, clinked his glass against Trent's, praising his recent real estate acquisitions. My mother, Yvonne, spent the entire appetizer course complimenting Gabrielle's designer dress and boasting about Gabrielle's luxury cosmetic line. Nobody asked about my degree. Nobody asked about the grueling late nights I spent analyzing financial data to earn my credentials. I sat quietly next to my grandfather, Elias, the patriarch of the family, who had flown up from Florida specifically for this dinner. Grandpa Elias was a retired real estate mogul who built his wealth from the ground up during the civil rights era. He was sharp, observant, and possessed a quiet authority that commanded absolute respect. He ate his steak in silence, his dark eyes taking in the dynamics of the table. The real trouble began when the waiter approached in a crisp black vest and placed a heavy leather folder on the center of the table. Trent immediately snatched it up. He opened the folder, let his eyes scan the total, and then slid the bill directly across the polished mahogany table until it hit my water glass. "You have a master's degree now, Imani," Trent announced, his voice carrying perfectly over the soft jazz playing in the background. "Pay for your family like an adult. It is time you stop acting like a charity case and learn some responsibility." I stared down at the receipt. The total was over $2,000. They had ordered the most expensive reserve wine, towering seafood platters, and premium Wagyu cuts. I had ordered a simple house salad and a glass of tap water. I looked up expecting my parents to intervene. Instead, my mother Yvonne rolled her eyes and crossed her arms. "Trent is absolutely right, Imani. You cannot expect us to fund your life forever. You have your little degree now. Maybe you can finally scrape together $40,000 a year at some entry-level desk job. Your sister Gabrielle pulls in twice that much in a single month just selling cosmetics online. You need to catch up." A hot flush of humiliation crept up my neck. I opened my mouth to defend myself, to remind them that I had paid my own tuition through scholarships and grueling analyst internships. But before I could speak a single word, the heavy scrape of a chair against the floor stopped everything. Grandpa Elias placed his silver fork down with a loud, deliberate clatter. The sound cut through the ambient noise of the restaurant like a gunshot. He picked up his napkin, slowly wiped his mouth, and turned his piercing gaze toward my mother. "Wait a minute," Grandpa Elias said, his deep voice rumbling with quiet danger. "Why is Imani worried about paying for anything? I am glad the $5,000 I send you each month is helping you focus on your studies, Imani. You should have plenty of savings by now." The air in the private room evaporated. Trent froze his wine glass halfway to his mouth. Gabrielle stopped fiddling with her bracelet. My father, Desmond, suddenly looked completely fascinated by his empty plate, his face draining of all color. I turned to my grandfather, genuinely confused. My voice shook slightly, but I forced the words out clear and steady. "Grandpa, I have never received a single dime from you. I paid for my entire degree using grants and working night shifts analyzing market data. I have no idea what money you are talking about." The silence that descended upon the room was absolute and terrifying. My mother, Yvonne, immediately jumped into action, her voice pitching an octave higher than normal in sheer panic. "Oh, it must be a bank routing error. You know how these digital transfers get messed up. The bank probably held the funds in an escrow account. We can call them on Monday and sort it out." "Do not worry about it, Dad. People make digital mistakes all the time." Trent quickly jumped in to back her up, his face flushing a blotchy red. "Exactly. The banking systems are a mess right now. Plus, elderly people often get confused with mobile transfers. You probably sent it to the wrong person, Elias. We will get my guys at the investment firm to track it down." Grandpa Elias did not argue. He did not yell. He simply reached into the breast pocket of his tailored suit jacket and pulled out a neatly folded piece of paper. He unfolded it and placed it directly in the center of the table, right on top of the $2,000 restaurant bill. "I do not make banking errors," Grandpa Elias stated coldly, "and I certainly do not get confused." I leaned forward to look at the paper. It was a certified bank statement from his private wealth management account. It showed a flawless record of $5,000 transfers occurring on the first of every month for the last 5 years. The receiving account clearly bore my full legal name. But my eyes gravitated toward the secondary contact information listed under the beneficiary details. The phone number linked to the account for withdrawal alerts and security codes did not belong to me. I knew that number by heart. It was the same number that had texted me demanding I pick up dry cleaning for family events. It was the same number that belonged to the man sitting across from me. I looked up from the paper and stared directly into my brother-in-law's eyes. "The security contact for my account is your cell phone number, Trent." My father, Desmond, slammed his fist onto the table, rattling the expensive crystal glasses. He pointed a shaking finger at my face. "So what if I had Trent manage the account? I kept it safe for you. Are you really going to sit here and accuse your own family of stealing? You have been leeching off this family your entire life. We were protecting those funds from your poor financial decisions." Before anyone could say another word, the dining room door swung open. The restaurant's general manager walked in holding a sleek black payment terminal. He bypassed my father entirely and walked straight to my sister. "Excuse me, Mrs. Gabrielle," the manager said, his tone dripping with professional apology but loud enough for the entire table to hear. "I am so sorry to interrupt your celebration. However, the platinum credit card you left on file for the incidental hold has just been declined by your bank. The alert specifically states the account is frozen due to severe delinquency and defaulted payments. Do you perhaps have another form of payment?" All eyes shifted from the bank statement on the table to Gabrielle. The wealthy, successful sister with the booming cosmetic line suddenly looked like she was going to be sick. The perfect family facade had just caught fire, and the flames were only beginning to spread. The silence in the private dining room was so heavy it felt hard to breathe. Trent snatched the black payment terminal from the manager with a swift and angry motion. His face was a deep shade of crimson as he pulled a different corporate card from his leather wallet and shoved it into the machine. The terminal beeped, approving the transaction, but the damage was already done. The illusion of my sister's flawless luxury lifestyle had shattered right in front of the one man my parents desperately wanted to impress. Grandpa Elias did not say another word about the bank statement or the frozen accounts. He simply stood up, buttoned his tailored suit jacket, and placed a crisp $100 bill on the table for the waiter. He looked at my father with a disappointment so profound it made Desmond shrink back into his chair. Then my grandfather turned and walked out the door without looking back. We followed him out into the warm and humid Atlanta night. The valet area outside the restaurant was crowded with luxury cars and people dressed for a Saturday night out in Buckhead, but all I could feel was the suffocating tension radiating from my family. As Grandpa Elias stepped into the back of his waiting town car and pulled away the polished masks my parents wore, instantly dropped. My father spun around to face me, his jaw clenched tight and his eyes furious. He pointed a finger at my chest. "I hope you are happy with yourself, Imani. You just could not let your sister have one nice evening. You had to cause a scene and humiliate us in front of your grandfather. I stared at him in absolute disbelief. I caused a scene, I asked, my voice steady, despite the adrenaline rushing through my veins. You and Mom have been stealing $5,000 a month from me for 5 years. You handed the money over to Trent, and you have the nerve to tell me I ruined dinner. My mother stepped between us, her eyes flashing with a defensive anger. Do not raise your voice to your father. We did what we had to do for this family. You were living in a cheap apartment eating ramen noodles while studying. You did not need that kind of money. Gabrielle needed inventory for her cosmetic line. She needed to maintain a lifestyle that Trent's wealthy family would respect. You have always been so selfish, Imani. You never think about what it takes to survive in these circles. Gabrielle started to cry, perfectly timed tears welling up in her eyes as she leaned against Trent, burying her face in his shoulder. It is ruined, Trent, she sobbed loudly enough for the valet attendants to hear. She is trying to ruin my business and our marriage. She has always been jealous of me. Ever since we were kids, she could never stand seeing me happy. I crossed my arms, feeling a cold detachment settle over me. Jealous of what, Gabrielle? Your frozen bank accounts or the fact that you have to steal from your younger sister to pretend you are wealthy? Before Gabrielle could answer, Trent stepped forward. He closed the distance between us until he was standing just inches from my face. The smell of expensive cologne and stale wine washed over me. He looked down at me with the kind of arrogant superiority that only a privileged investment banker could muster. Listen to me very carefully, he said, dropping his voice to a menacing whisper so the valet could not hear. I am a senior director at Horizon Capital. I handle portfolios worth more than your entire graduating class will make in a lifetime. I know every major player in the Atlanta financial sector. If you breathe a word of this to anyone, if you try to take legal action against your parents, or create a scandal that touches my name, I will personally guarantee that your shiny new degree becomes completely worthless. I will make one phone call and you will never find a job in finance in this state. Do you understand me? My mother nodded in agreement from behind him. You better listen to him, Imani. Trent is powerful. You are just starting out. Do not throw your future away just because you are holding a petty grudge over some money we borrowed for your sister. Borrowed, I repeated. You funneled it through an account with Trent's phone number. That is wire fraud. Trent laughed, a harsh and dismissive sound. Prove it. It is your word against your parents, and nobody is going to believe a bitter and single girl who has always been the black sheep of the family. Keep your mouth shut, go back to your little apartment, and be grateful we even invited you out tonight. The valet pulled my car up to the curb. It was a modest 5-year-old sedan, a stark contrast to Trent's gleaming Porsche parked in the VIP section next to it. I did not say another word to them. I did not need to. I knew exactly who they were now, and I knew exactly what I had to do. I got into my car, locked the doors, and watched through the rearview mirror as my family wrapped their arms around Gabrielle, comforting the woman who had just been caught living on stolen funds. I pulled out of the restaurant parking lot and drove a few blocks down Peachtree Street before pulling into an empty parking lot to catch my breath. My hands were shaking against the steering wheel. The reality of their betrayal was heavy, but the nagging feeling in the back of my mind was heavier. If my parents were bold enough to intercept Grandpa Elias's trust payments for 5 years, what else had they done? If Trent was so desperate to keep me quiet, what else was he hiding behind his arrogant threats? I picked up my phone from the passenger seat. I had a premium credit monitoring application that I rarely checked because I always paid my few bills on time and avoided debt. I opened the app, letting the face recognition scan log me in. The screen loaded, and the bright green circle that usually displayed my excellent credit score had turned a deep and angry red. My heart slammed against my ribs. My credit score had plummeted by nearly 200 points. I frantically tapped the screen, scrolling down to the recent activity section. There, sitting at the very top of my credit report, was an active commercial loan from First Atlanta Bank. The loan was for $250,000. I could not breathe. I tapped on the loan details. It had been taken out 3 years ago, right around the time Gabrielle launched her luxury cosmetic line. The status of the loan was marked in bright red letters. It read, "Severe default delinquent over 120 days." My parents and my sister had not just stolen my monthly allowance. They had stolen my identity. They had forged my signature to take out $250,000 business loan in my name, and they had defaulted on it, destroying my financial future in the process. The cold detachment I felt at the restaurant vanished, replaced by a burning and white-hot rage. First thing Monday morning, I dressed in a tailored charcoal suit and drove straight to the downtown branch of First Atlanta Bank. This was the bank my father had used for his business account since I was a child. The heavy glass doors slid open to reveal a sprawling lobby of polished marble. I walked directly to the receptionist and demanded to see the branch manager immediately. Before she could ask if I had an appointment, the heavy mahogany door behind her opened. Marcus stepped out, holding a cup of coffee. Marcus was not just a branch manager. He was one of my father's oldest fraternity brothers. I had known him since I was 10 years old. He used to come to our summer barbecues and slip me $5 bills. He spotted me and a wide artificial smile spread across his face. "Imani. Little Imani Wilson," he boomed, walking over with his arms outstretched. "Desmond told me you just finished your degree. Congratulations, sweetheart." I did not return his smile, stepping back to avoid his hug. "I need to see you in your office, Marcus, regarding a fraudulent loan taken out in my name." His smile faltered before he quickly recovered his jovial facade. He gestured for me to follow him into his office, closing the heavy door behind us. The room smelled of expensive leather and stale cigars. I sat across from his desk and pulled out my phone, placing it on the desk to show the screenshot of my credit report. There is a $250,000 business loan attached to my Social Security number. It was issued by this specific branch 3 years ago, and it is currently in severe default. I need to see the original signature cards and the loan origination documents right now. Marcus did not even look at the phone. He leaned back in his leather chair, giving me a look of deep, patronizing pity. "Imani, let us take a breath and calm down. I know all about that account. Your father and I set it up together to help secure your financial future. You signed those papers yourself in this very office. That is a lie. I have never signed a loan document in my life. Show me the signature cards, Marcus. If I signed them, you should have no problem pulling them from the vault." He shook his head slowly, a condescending smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. "I cannot do that, sweetheart. Bank policy restricts access without a formal legal request. But even if I could, I would not. Your father warned me this might happen. He told me about your mental breakdown a few years ago. He said you have been having memory issues and episodes of paranoia." I felt a cold wave wash over my entire body. A mental breakdown. My parents had not just stolen my identity. They had planted a false narrative with a bank manager to cover their tracks just in case I found out. They had painted me as an unstable and unreliable woman who simply could not remember signing away $250,000. "You are gaslighting me to cover up a felony," I said, my voice dangerously low. "You approved a fraudulent loan for your fraternity brother without verifying the signatures. You knew they were using my clean credit to fund whatever scam Trent and Gabrielle were running." Marcus dropped the friendly uncle act instantly. His face hardened, and he leaned forward, placing his hands flat on the desk. "Listen to me very carefully, little girl. You are sitting in my bank making wild and defamatory accusations against respected members of this community. Your father is a prominent businessman. Your brother-in-law manages millions. You are a confused young woman with a history of emotional instability. If you do not lower your voice and leave my office right now, I will have security escort you out and ban you from the premises." He reached for the heavy black telephone on his desk, keeping his eyes locked on mine. A normal person would have panicked. A normal person would have cried or rushed out of the room feeling defeated and crazy. But I was not normal, and I certainly was not the emotionally unstable child they were trying to paint me as. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice. I simply unzipped my leather tote bag and pulled out my silver laptop. I opened it and entered my password, rotating the screen so it faced Marcus directly. I have not been sitting in my apartment, crying Marcus. I spent the last 48 hours running a deep dive forensic analysis on the financial footprint of my entire family. You see, the thing about high finance is that there is always a paper trail if you know exactly how to break through the encryption. I tapped the keyboard, bringing up a highly classified public registry document that I had extracted using the software I built. It was the collateral agreement for the $250,000 loan. You did not just forge my signature, Marcus. You allowed my father to collateralize this loan using Gabrielle's luxury boutique as the primary asset. Marcus stared at the screen, his face draining of blood. I continued, my voice steady and completely devoid of mercy. Gabrielle's boutique has been operating at a massive loss for 36 months. The business is failing. She has zero liquid assets and her inventory is worthless. You approved a $250,000 loan backed by a failing business and tied it to a student with no income because Trent promised you a cut of the offshore returns. You bypassed every single federal underwriting regulation to help your college buddy commit wire fraud. And I have the digital footprint to prove it to the federal authorities. I am going to destroy you all, I promised with a smile. I walked out of the bank into the blinding morning sun. The thread I left hanging in the manager's office felt good, but it was not enough to extinguish the fire burning in my chest. I knew exactly where the stolen money had gone, and I knew exactly where to find the people who had stolen it. I got into my car and drove straight toward Midtown Atlanta. Gabrielle had been bragging about the grand opening of her flagship luxury cosmetic boutique for months, posting endless updates about the custom marble floors and imported crystal chandeliers. As I pulled up to the curb on Peachtree Street, the sheer audacity of it all made my stomach turn. A long red carpet stretched across the wide sidewalk, flanked by velvet ropes and towering floral arrangements. Valets were sprinting back and forth in the Georgia heat, parking a parade of imported sports cars and luxury vehicles. Inside the floor-to-ceiling glass storefront, waiters in crisp white jackets circulated with silver trays of champagne and miniature hors d'oeuvres. It was a flawless illusion of wealth, an empire of vanity completely funded by my stolen identity. I pushed past the velvet rope at the entrance, ignoring the frantic hostess who tried to ask for my invitation. The boutique was loud, filled with the pulsing beat of house music and the chatter of Atlanta socialites and local influencers milling around the displays. They were sampling overpriced serums, taking photos in front of custom neon signs, and laughing. Gabrielle was completely in her element. She wore a tailored white designer dress, her hair perfectly styled in loose waves, playing the role of the successful self-made entrepreneur to absolute perfection. I spotted her disappearing behind a heavy frosted glass door marked Private VIP Lounge. My mother Yvonne was right behind her, carrying a glass of rose champagne and looking like she owned the entire building. I followed them, weaving through the dense crowd of wealthy patrons and pushing the heavy glass door open before it could latch shut behind my mother. The VIP lounge was quiet, heavily insulated from the loud music of the main floor. The room smelled of expensive perfume and fresh lilies. Gabrielle was standing in front of a massive lighted vanity mirror, carefully reapplying her signature red lipstick, while my mother watched her with an expression of pure, unadulterated adoration. Their heads snapped toward me the second the door clicked shut. "What are you doing here?" Gabrielle demanded, her perfect smile vanishing, instantly replaced by a look of sheer panic. "This is a private event, Imani. You are not on the guest list, and you are definitely not dressed for this." I ignored her insult. I walked right up to the vanity, closing the distance between us. I did not yell. I did not scream. I spoke with a quiet, icy clarity that made them both freeze in their tracks. "I just had a very interesting conversation with Marcus at the bank," I said. "Did you really think you could take out a $250,000 commercial loan in my name, default on it, and use my ruined credit to fund this failing store without me finding out?" Gabrielle dropped her lipstick. The gold tube clattered loudly against the polished marble counter and rolled onto the floor. She looked at our mother, absolute terror flashing in her wide eyes. Yvonne stepped between us, her jaw set tight. She did not look guilty. She did not look ashamed. She looked profoundly annoyed. "I told Trent you would figure it out eventually," my mother sneered, taking a slow sip of her champagne. "You always were too nosy for your own good. You just cannot let people be happy." "You stole my identity," I said, my voice rising just enough to let the deep anger bleed through. "You ruined my credit and defaulted on $250,000 just so Gabrielle could pretend she runs a successful business. That is a federal crime." My mother did not flinch. She set her champagne glass down on a side table and stepped right into my personal space, her eyes narrowing into cold slits. "And what exactly were you going to do with that credit score, Imani? Buy a slightly nicer sedan, get a slightly bigger apartment? You are a selfish, ordinary girl who would not know what to do with real money anyway. Gabrielle needs this. She needs the lifestyle and the appearance of elite success." I stared at the woman who gave birth to me, trying to comprehend the twisted, broken logic that made destroying one daughter perfectly acceptable if it meant elevating the other. "You committed wire fraud to impress Trent's family," I asked, the disgust thick and heavy in my throat. "You sold me out so Gabrielle could buy designer handbags and pretend she belongs in their tax bracket." The sound of the slap echoed sharply in the small, quiet room. My cheek burned instantly, my head snapping to the side from the sudden force of my mother's hand. The physical sting was nothing compared to the profound betrayal radiating from her. I slowly turned my face back to look at her, refusing to raise my hand to my cheek, refusing to show her any weakness. "Do not you ever speak about your sister that way," Yvonne hissed, her face contorted with ugly rage. "We are a family. We do what we have to do to elevate the family name and secure our position. Trent gave us the connection at the bank, and we took it because you owe us. We raised you. We fed you. It is your duty to lift your sister up. Now you are going to turn around, walk out that door, and keep your mouth shut, or I promise you I will make your life a living hell." I looked directly into my mother's cold eyes. "You do not have the power to make my life a living hell anymore," I whispered. "I am going straight to the police. Actually, they are already here." The voice came from the doorway. I turned to see Trent standing there looking incredibly pleased with himself. He was not alone. Two uniformed Atlanta police officers stood right behind him in the doorway, their hands resting casually near their heavy utility belts. Trent had not missed a beat. The moment he realized I was at the bank, he must have known I would come here next. He had prepared his trap and waited for me to walk right into it. "Officers," Trent said, using his most polite and authoritative corporate voice. "This is the woman I called you about, my sister-in-law. She has a history of severe mental instability, and she has been harassing my wife all morning. We asked her to leave our private event, but she forced her way into the VIP lounge to threaten my family and disrupt our business. I need her removed for trespassing immediately." The two officers stepped into the room. "Ma'am," the taller officer said, reaching out to firmly grasp my arm, "you need to come with us right now. Do not cause a scene, or we will have to put you in handcuffs." Gabrielle immediately started crying, clutching Trent's arm and burying her face in his expensive suit jacket. "I am so scared, Trent," she whimpered loudly, ensuring the officers could hear every word. "She has been acting so crazy lately. I do not know what she is capable of doing to us." My mother patted Gabrielle's back, shaking her head at the officers with a look of manufactured maternal sorrow. "We have tried to get her psychiatric help, officers, but she refuses to take her medication. It is just a terrible family tragedy. We just want her to get the help she needs." I did not fight the officers. I let them turn me around and guide me toward the door. I knew exactly how this looked. An angry, underdressed woman crashing a high society grand opening, being physically restrained by the police, while the wealthy owners played the innocent, terrified victims. Fighting them would only give Trent and my mother the unhinged narrative they were trying so desperately to build. I kept my face completely blank, my posture straight and dignified. As the officers walked me past Trent, he leaned in close, a triumphant smirk plastered across his face. He thought he had won. He thought calling the police and weaponizing my own family against me would break my spirit. He thought I was just a helpless, ordinary girl who would fold under the crushing pressure of his influence and wealth. I stopped walking for a fraction of a second, causing the officer holding my arm to pause. I leaned my head slightly toward my brother-in-law, my voice completely steady, completely devoid of fear. I looked right into his arrogant eyes. "Your boutique is built on wire fraud," I whispered softly. "Federal offense. See you at the audit, Trent." The two police officers walked me out into the heavy Atlanta humidity. Once we were out of sight of the glamorous grand opening, the taller officer simply let go of my arm and sighed. He told me to go home and sleep it off, treating the whole ordeal like a predictable reality television spat between spoiled sisters. Trent had not pressed formal charges for trespassing. Filing a police report meant establishing a public record, and men with dark financial secrets absolutely despise public records. I thanked the officers politely, got into my modest 5-year-old sedan, and pulled away from the curb. My cheek still throbbed with the dull heat from where my mother had struck me. It was a lingering physical reminder of exactly where I stood in my family hierarchy. But the hurt that had been boiling in my blood was slowly crystallizing into something much more dangerous. I felt a pure and calculated focus taking over my mind. I drove across town to my apartment building in West Midtown. From the outside, it was a completely unremarkable brick complex. My parents had visited exactly twice in the last 5 years, both times, complaining about the lack of valet parking and the scuffed linoleum in the hallway. They truly believed I was barely scraping by on a tiny graduate student stipend, living a sad and ordinary life. I unlocked my front door and stepped into the living room. It was furnished with cheap flat-pack furniture and generic canvas prints, serving as the perfect camouflage for an unassuming financial analyst. I locked the deadbolt behind me, walked straight down the narrow hallway to the unassuming linen closet, and pushed aside a row of heavy winter coats. I placed my thumb against a small biometric scanner concealed perfectly behind a loose piece of drywall. The scanner beeped a soft affirmative note. The entire back wall of the closet unlocked with a heavy mechanical click and slid open smoothly. I stepped through this hidden doorway, and the world completely transformed. The hidden space spanned the entire square footage of the adjacent apartment, a unit I had quietly purchased through a blind trust 2 years ago and completely gutted. The industrial air conditioning hummed loudly, keeping the massive racks of high-speed enterprise servers ice cold. The walls were lined with towering curved monitors, displaying endless cascades of financial data, predictive processing algorithms, and encrypted global market feeds. This was not the apartment of an ordinary girl struggling to make rent. This was the highly secure command center of a self-made multimillionaire. Sitting at the central console and typing furiously at a mechanical keyboard was Roxanne. She was my brilliant business partner, my fiercely loyal best friend, and the only person in the world who actually knew the truth about my life. Roxanne spun her ergonomic chair around as I walked in. She was wearing a vintage university sweatshirt, her thick locks pulled up into a messy bun, and a sharp, knowing grin on her face. Then she took one look at the red welt forming on my cheek, and her smile vanished. It was instantly replaced by a cold and protective fury. I told her exactly what had happened at the boutique, what my mother had done, and the arrogant threats Trent had whispered in my ear. Roxanne just shook her head, her fingers flying across her keyboard to pull up our primary software interface. My family thought I was a nobody. What they did not know was that for the last 4 years, Roxanne and I had secretly built a proprietary artificial intelligence auditing software. Our system was specifically designed to hunt down institutional fraud, untangling complex corporate embezzlement schemes in a matter of seconds. 3 of the largest investment banks on Wall Street currently paid us massive 7-figure licensing fees just to use our basic beta version. I had more money sitting in my secondary checking account than Trent and Gabrielle could ever dream of making in a lifetime. I had never needed Grandpa Elias and his $5,000 a month. I never even missed it. But my parents had stolen it anyway. They had stolen my identity and leveraged my future just to maintain their pathetic illusion of high society superiority. "Are we burning them down?" Roxanne asked, her voice deadly serious, as she pulled up a fresh command window. I stood beside her, looking at the massive glowing screens. "Burn them down to the foundation," I replied. "Let us start with Trent. Pull up the data I scraped from Marcus at the bank registry this morning. I want to see exactly how Trent structured that forged loan." Roxanne tapped a few keys easily, bypassing the bank's pathetic security firewalls using the backdoor access we had established hours ago. Trent's entire financial life blossomed across the monitors in bright blue data nodes. We watched the digital flow of the stolen $250,000. Trent had routed the funds from the fraudulent commercial loan directly into Gabrielle's business account, giving it the clean appearance of legitimate venture capital. But the money did not stay in the cosmetic boutique's operational fund. Roxanne isolated a secondary wire transfer that occurred less than 48 hours after the loan was initially deposited. The luxury cosmetics line was just a convenient washing machine for dirty money. "Look at this," Roxanne whispered, highlighting a massive outbound wire transfer on the center screen. "He did not use that $250,000 to buy inventory or pay for marketing. He immediately funneled over $200,000 right back out of Gabrielle's company." I leaned in closer, my eyes tracking the complex routing numbers as our artificial intelligence rapidly decoded the offshore destinations. The money bounced through a ghost shell company in Delaware before landing quietly in a heavily encrypted private account in the Cayman Islands. Our software pinged the final destination, identifying the shadow holding company associated with the account. My breath hitched in my throat as the true scale of his deception appeared on the screen. The holding company belonged to an underground high-stakes sports betting syndicate. Trent was not just an arrogant, embezzling fraud who looked down on my family. He was a degenerate gambler, and he was currently drowning in $250,000 of violent offshore debt. The silence in the server room was broken only by the heavy hum of the industrial cooling units. Roxanne kept her hands perfectly still over her mechanical keyboard as we both stared at the massive curved monitors. Trent was not just stealing from my family to fund Gabrielle's vanity project. He was hemorrhaging hundreds of thousands of dollars to cover his offshore gambling debts. The Cayman Island accounts were a digital graveyard of his massive failures, and our artificial intelligence software had just dragged every single one of his secrets into the light. My cell phone began to vibrate violently against the metal surface of the workstation. The screen flashed with a restricted caller identification. I hesitated for a fraction of a second before picking it up and pressing it to my ear. I did not say a word. I just waited for the caller to speak. "Imani, it is time to stop playing games," the deep and raspy voice said. It was Grandpa Elias. But the fragile and defeated old man who had silently walked out of the private dining room in Buckhead was completely gone. His voice was sharp and commanding. He carried the ruthless authority of a man who had built a financial empire from absolutely nothing. He told me he was calling from an untraceable prepaid phone. He instructed me to put him on speaker so Roxanne could hear him too. I froze and looked at Roxanne. She raised an eyebrow and nodded quickly. I placed the phone on the central console and activated the speaker. I asked him how he knew about Roxanne and my highly secure location. Elias let out a dry and humorless laugh. He told me he was the patriarch of the Wilson family, and he never let any asset go unmonitored. He knew I had never touched the $5,000 monthly allowance. He knew I had spent the last 4 years building a revolutionary auditing software. He even knew we had recently secured massive licensing contracts with several major Wall Street firms. He had watched me become a self-made multimillionaire in total secrecy, and he had been waiting for the perfect moment to step out of the shadows. Elias told me to listen very carefully. He explained that he was not senile, and he had never been fooled by Desmond and Yvonne's pathetic masquerade. He had known for exactly 3 years that my parents were forging my signature and intercepting my trust fund payments to finance Trent and Gabrielle's luxurious lifestyle. I felt a sudden rush of bitter anger. I asked him why he let them do it, and why he let me believe my own family was just careless rather than criminal. Elias kept his voice perfectly level. He explained that our family legacy was a delicate ecosystem. Trent was a senior director at Horizon Capital. If Elias had simply cut off the money and exposed a minor embezzlement scheme, Trent's powerful corporate lawyers would have buried the evidence and shielded his public reputation. Elias needed absolute and undeniable proof of something much larger. He needed to track the offshore wire fraud and the illegal gambling syndicates. He had to let Trent get comfortable. He had to let him get incredibly sloppy. The tense dinner at the restaurant was a calculated test, Elias explained. He brought the frozen bank statements to force their hand. He knew they would panic, and he knew they would turn their aggression toward me. He needed a catalyst to activate my specific skill set. He needed my artificial intelligence software to breach the final layer of the Cayman Island banking encryption, because his own expensive private investigators could not get past Trent's digital firewalls. Elias gave us a direct command. He needed Roxanne and me to isolate every single fraudulent transaction Trent had authorized over the last 36 months. He needed the complete shadow ledger downloaded and delivered to his private server by midnight. He was going to use it to legally destroy Trent and strip my parents of everything they owned without allowing the scandal to touch the Wilson family name. "We can get you the ledger," Roxanne said, her fingers already flying across the keyboard to isolate the offshore routing numbers. But then Elias dropped a warning that made the blood freeze in my veins. He told us we needed to work faster than we ever had before because our window of opportunity was rapidly closing. He had highly placed contacts inside the Fulton County Courthouse, and they had just intercepted a devastating legal maneuver. Elias explained that my parents were absolutely terrified after my confrontation at the bank and the boutique. They knew I was hunting them, and they knew their financial crimes were unraveling. Desmond and Yvonne were not just trying to silence me through intimidation anymore. They were actively moving to file an emergency medical injunction to have me forcibly committed to a state psychiatric facility. The horrifying reality of their plan suddenly slammed into my chest. Marcus, the bank manager, casually mentioning my supposed mental breakdown. My mother slapping me and yelling about my psychiatric medication in front of the Atlanta police officers. It was all a carefully orchestrated performance. They were building a documented legal history of severe emotional instability. Elias told me their ultimate goal was to obtain a total medical conservatorship over my life. They wanted to seize legal control of my assets, lock me in a padded room, and bury the evidence of their massive wire fraud forever. "You do not have much time, Imani," my grandfather whispered through the phone. "They are coming for you tonight." The line went dead, leaving Roxanne and me standing in the freezing server room. The glowing light of the monitors cast long shadows across the floor. "They are coming for me," I repeated, letting the reality of my grandfather's warning sink in. My parents were not just greedy and desperate, they were dangerous. They were willing to institutionalize their own daughter to protect a gambling addict and a failing cosmetics store. Roxanne spun back to her keyboard. Her fingers moved with blistering speed as she began compiling the shadow ledger from Trent's offshore accounts. "We are not going to let them take you, Imani," she said, her eyes locked on the scrolling data. "We have until midnight to get this ledger to Elias, but we need to make sure you are not locked in a padded room before then." Just as she spoke, my cell phone lit up on the console. It was my mother. I stared at the screen, watching the name Yvonne flash repeatedly. I took a deep breath, cleared my throat, and answered the call. "Imani, sweetheart," my mother said, her voice trembling with manufactured tears. "I am so sorry about what happened at the boutique today. I lost my temper, and I never should have raised my hand to you. Your father and I have been talking, and we are just so heartbroken. We want to make things right. Please come over to the house tonight. We need to talk this out as a family." I listened to her perfectly modulated performance. If Elias had not warned me, I might have believed the sorrow in her voice. I might have walked right into their trap expecting an apology. Instead, I kept my voice completely neutral. I told her I would be there in an hour. I hung up the phone and looked at Roxanne. "They want me to come to the house," I said. Roxanne nodded slowly, pulling a thick black smartwatch out of a desk drawer. She tossed it to me. "Put this on," she instructed. "I am going to sync the camera and microphone to the internal network at your parents' house. Desmond still uses that basic router password I cracked 3 years ago. When you walk into that living room, I will have full access to their smart home system. You just give me the signal." I strapped the heavy watch to my wrist and drove through the dark Atlanta streets toward the wealthy suburb where I grew up. The sprawling brick house looked entirely peaceful from the outside. The manicured lawn was perfectly illuminated by landscape lighting. I parked my modest sedan in the circular driveway and walked up the stone steps to the front porch. Desmond opened the door before I could even ring the bell. He wore a heavy cashmere sweater and a strained smile. "Come in, Imani," he said, ushering me into the grand foyer. "Your mother is waiting in the living room." The house was unnervingly quiet. Gabrielle was nowhere to be seen. I walked down the long hallway, feeling the heavy silence pressing in on me from all sides. I stepped down into the sunken living room and stopped cold. My mother was standing by the stone fireplace, clutching a tissue and trying to look devastated. But she was not alone. Sitting on the white leather sofa was a strange man in a dark clinical polo shirt. He held a black medical bag on his lap. He did not look like a family friend or a neighbor. He looked exactly like a hired professional who asked absolutely no questions. Behind me, I heard the heavy front door slam shut. The deadbolt clicked into place with a loud metallic thud. Trent walked into the living room from the hallway, crossing his arms and standing directly in front of the only exit. His arrogant smirk was back in full force. The strange man on the sofa stood up. He spoke in a slow, soothing tone that made my skin crawl. "Hello, Imani. I am Dr. Vance. I am a private psychiatric specialist. Your parents called me tonight because they are deeply concerned about your well-being." My mother let out a dramatic sob, pressing the tissue to her face. "Oh, Imani, you have been so sick," she cried. "You barged into your sister's grand opening screaming about fake loans and stolen identity. You are having delusions, sweetheart. You are seeing things that are not real. We are just so terrified that you might hurt yourself or someone else." Desmond stepped forward, placing a heavy hand on my shoulder. "We are doing this because we love you, Imani. You have suffered a severe psychotic break. The pressure of your studies has simply been too much for your mind to handle. Dr. Vance is going to take you to a beautiful private facility in North Georgia. You will be safe there while we arrange a medical conservatorship to manage your affairs." They were reading from a script. They were laying out the legal foundation to steal my life right in front of me. I looked at Trent blocking the doorway. He was thoroughly enjoying the show. Dr. Vance unzipped his black bag and pulled out a syringe. He filled it from a small vial of clear liquid and tapped the side with his finger. "This is just a mild sedative, Imani. It will help you calm down for the drive. You are experiencing elevated paranoia and we need to lower your heart rate. Please just offer your arm and make this easy on your family." Trent took a step toward me, his eyes shining with malicious glee. "You should listen to the doctor, Imani. Nobody is going to believe a crazy woman who thinks her loving family is stealing from her. You are going to go away for a very long time, and we are going to take care of everything you leave behind." I did not back away from the needle. I did not scream for help. I looked directly into Trent's eyes and let a slow, cold smile spread across my face. "I think you misunderstood exactly who is in danger here, Trent," I said calmly. I raised my left arm and pressed the small tactile button on the side of my smartwatch. For a split second, nothing happened. Then the massive 80-inch smart television mounted above the fireplace suddenly powered on with a loud electronic chime. Dr. Vance jumped back, nearly dropping the syringe. Trent spun around to look at the screen. The display flashed bright blue before dividing perfectly into a split-screen grid. On the left side of the television was a crystal-clear live stream of the living room we were standing in. Roxanne had hacked the camera on the smart television itself, capturing Trent blocking the door, my mother faking her tears, and the shady doctor holding a sedative injection. But it was the right side of the screen that made all the blood drain from Desmond and Yvonne's faces. It was a secure video conference feed. Sitting at the head of a long, polished mahogany table was Grandpa Elias. He was wearing a sharp, tailored suit, looking completely awake and infinitely powerful. Flanking him on both sides were 6 men and women in dark business attire. They were the most ruthless corporate litigators in the state of Georgia. Elias leaned forward into his camera. His piercing eyes locked directly on my parents. Elias leaned forward into his camera. His piercing eyes locked directly on my parents. He did not raise his voice, but he spoke with the quiet and terrifying calm of an apex predator who had finally trapped his prey. He informed Desmond and Yvonne that the 6 people sitting beside him were drafting federal indictments for wire fraud, identity theft, and criminal conspiracy. He then turned his attention to Dr. Vance. Elias recited the doctor's full legal name, his medical license number, and the exact address of his hidden private practice. He calmly explained that if the syringe moved 1 single inch closer to my arm, the doctor would spend the rest of his natural life in a federal penitentiary for attempted medical kidnapping. The color completely drained from Dr. Vance's face. His hand started shaking so violently that he dropped the glass syringe. It hit the hardwood floor and shattered, spilling the clear sedative across the expensive rug. He grabbed his black medical bag, stammered a pathetic and breathless apology, and ran out the front door without looking back. My parents were frozen in absolute terror. Desmond was staring at the television screen with his mouth hanging open, unable to form a single coherent word. Yvonne had collapsed onto the white leather sofa, her hands covering her face, as she finally realized that her entire illusion of wealth and control had just been completely destroyed. Trent was backing away from the door, his arrogant smirk entirely erased. His eyes darted nervously between the massive screen and me. He knew his offshore gambling debts were no longer a secret, and the reality of his looming prison sentence was sinking in. I did not say a word to any of them. I simply lowered my wrist, walked past my trembling parents, and stepped out the front door into the cool Atlanta night. I got into my car and drove away, leaving them to face the devastating wrath of Elias Wilson. The next morning, the bright Atlanta sun rose over the sleek glass towers of the financial district. Inside the massive corporate headquarters of Horizon Capital, Trent was sweating through his custom-tailored designer suit. He sat in his corner office staring at his dual monitors with bloodshot and frantic eyes. He had been up all night, desperately trying to cover his digital tracks. He knew my grandfather possessed the shadow ledger, but Trent was a senior director with high-level security clearance. He arrogantly believed that Elias was just a dinosaur from the old days of traditional banking. Trent thought that if he could just scramble the internal routing numbers and bury the missing funds deep inside a few forgotten client portfolios, he could survive the inevitable fallout. He just needed a few more hours to manipulate the corporate mainframe and hide his tracks. His office phone buzzed loudly, breaking his frantic concentration. It was his managing partner, Richard. The voice on the speakerphone was tense and clipped. Richard ordered Trent to the top-floor executive boardroom immediately. There was an emergency crisis meeting for all senior directors, and attendance was strictly mandatory. Trent wiped the cold sweat from his forehead, grabbed his suit jacket, and took the private elevator up to the penthouse level. When he walked into the boardroom, the atmosphere was thick and suffocating. 10 of the highest-ranking executives in the entire firm were sitting around the massive glass table, looking completely terrified. Richard stood at the head of the table, holding a thick stack of printed financial reports. Richard did not waste any time with pleasantries. He announced that the firm was facing a catastrophic crisis that could destroy their entire reputation. The overnight compliance checks had triggered a massive red flag in the main system. Millions of dollars were missing from their most exclusive client portfolios. The money had been systematically siphoned out through a highly sophisticated embezzlement scheme that intentionally bypassed all their standard security protocols. Trent felt his stomach drop to the floor. He tried to maintain a neutral and concerned expression, but his heart was hammering violently against his ribs. He opened his mouth to suggest an internal review, hoping he could volunteer to lead the investigation himself and delete the remaining evidence. Before Trent could speak, Richard raised his hand and silenced the room. He explained that the board of directors had already made a unanimous decision. Because the missing funds were directly tied to international wire transfers and offshore shell companies, they could no longer trust their own internal compliance department. The board had authorized a mandatory and immediate external audit. They had hired a ruthless new tech firm that specialized in tracking untraceable offshore assets using advanced artificial intelligence. Trent felt a sickening wave of sheer panic wash over him. He knew exactly what an external audit meant for his career and his freedom. It meant total exposure. He quickly stood up from his leather chair, his voice cracking slightly as he desperately argued against the decision. He told Richard that bringing in outsiders would cause a massive public relations scandal and spook their biggest investors. He insisted that the senior directors could handle the discrepancy internally and fix the portfolios before the clients ever noticed a single missing cent. He was practically begging them to keep the data in-house so he could save himself. Richard shook his head with grim finality. He told Trent it was too late to argue. The tech firm had already signed the non-disclosure agreements and their elite auditing team had just arrived in the building. They were going to seize control of the servers, freeze all executive trading accounts, and audit every single transaction from the last 3 years. The heavy double doors of the executive boardroom suddenly clicked unlocked. Richard gestured toward the grand entrance and announced that the lead external auditor had just arrived to take absolute control of the investigation. Trent turned around, preparing to charm or manipulate whoever was walking through those mahogany doors. He plastered a fake and confident smile across his face, hoping to project the image of a helpful and innocent senior director. The doors swung open. I walked into the boardroom wearing a sharp slate gray business suit and carrying a silver briefcase containing all of his darkest secrets. I looked directly at Trent and watched his fake smile completely dissolve into absolute and undeniable horror. Trent stood frozen at the head of the boardroom table. His jaw dropped open and all the color drained from his face as he stared at me. The other senior directors were completely confused by his sudden silence. Richard introduced me as the lead auditor from the external tech firm. I walked calmly to the center of the room and placed my silver briefcase on the glass table. I did not break eye contact with Trent for a single second. I told the board of directors that my team had already secured the servers and we were ready to begin the forensic analysis. Trent was practically vibrating with panic. He knew my software could unravel his entire life in a matter of minutes. He abruptly interrupted Richard and said he needed to speak with the lead auditor privately to discuss internal security protocols. Richard looked annoyed, but he agreed and dismissed the rest of the board. As soon as the heavy wooden doors closed behind the executives, Trent rushed toward me. He grabbed my arm and dragged me into the adjacent glass-walled executive office. He closed the glass door and pulled the privacy blinds down with trembling hands. The arrogant and untouchable golden boy was completely gone. Trent looked absolutely pathetic. Sweat was pouring down his forehead and soaking the collar of his expensive designer shirt. He dropped to his knees right in front of me and actually started crying. He begged me not to run the proprietary software on his specific client portfolios. He told me that if I exposed the missing millions, he would be sent to federal prison for a very long time. He said Gabrielle would immediately file for divorce and take everything he had left. He pleaded with me to remember that we were family and that ruining him would bring a terrible scandal upon my own sister. I just stood there looking down at him with absolute disgust. I reminded him that he did not care about family when he and my parents were stealing my trust fund. I told him he did not care about a scandal when he was funneling stolen money into illegal offshore betting syndicates. Trent stood up and frantically wiped the tears from his face. He moved to his leather briefcase and pulled out a thick, heavy manila envelope. He slid it across the glass table toward me with shaking hands. He told me there was $500,000 in untraceable cash inside that envelope. He promised it was mine to keep if I simply erased his name from the audit report and blamed the missing funds on a phantom hacking group. He said I could take the money and walk away from my family forever, just like I always wanted. He was sweating bullets as he waited for my answer, his eyes darting frantically between my face and the thick envelope of cash. I looked at the envelope and then I looked back at Trent. I slowly reached out and placed my hand firmly over the cash. I told him I would take care of the audit report exactly the way it needed to be done. I picked up the heavy envelope and offered him a polite and chilling smile. I turned around and walked out of the glass-walled office without saying another word. Trent let out a massive sigh of relief. He slumped backward against the glass wall, believing he had just successfully bought his freedom and outsmarted my grandfather. He wiped his sweating hands down the front of his trousers and walked over to the desk to pour himself a glass of water. But as he reached for the crystal pitcher, he stopped dead in his tracks. He stared down at his hands in absolute horror. His hands were glowing with a brilliant and vibrant bright blue light. The brilliant color was spreading across his fingers and staining the cuffs of his expensive shirt. He had no idea that Marcus, the bank manager, was secretly working directly for Grandpa Elias. When Trent made his desperate cash withdrawal that morning, Marcus had intentionally coated the money and the manila envelope in a high-grade military ultraviolet tracking ink. The ink was completely invisible to the naked eye until it was exposed to the natural sunlight streaming through the penthouse windows. Trent realized with a sickening wave of dread that he had just handed a marked bribe directly to a federal auditor. The news of the glowing ultraviolet ink spread through the executive suite of Horizon Capital in a matter of seconds. Trent was immediately escorted out of the building by corporate security while my auditing team seized every single hard drive in his office. My grandfather Elias had engineered the perfect trap, and Trent had walked right into it. But the desperate animals in my family were not ready to surrender just yet. My mother realized that intimidation and bribery had completely failed. She knew the walls were closing in, and she decided to detonate a social bomb to save her own reputation. I was sitting in the back of a black car heading back to my secure server room when my cell phone began to vibrate relentlessly. Notification after notification flooded my screen in a chaotic blur. Roxanne sent me a direct message with a single link attached. I tapped the screen and a video opened. It was a live broadcast on social media. My mother Yvonne was sitting in the center of her pristine suburban living room. She was looking directly into the camera with tears streaming down her perfectly contoured face. She had activated a live broadcast to her entire church congregation, her country club friends, and every single member of our extended family. It was the performance of a lifetime. She sniffled and dabbed at her eyes, weaving a horrific and completely fabricated story about my spectacular downfall. She told hundreds of viewers that I was deeply and dangerously ill. She claimed that the pressure of my graduate studies had pushed me into severe drug addiction. Her voice cracked as she painted a picture of a tragic daughter who had lost her mind. But she did not stop there. Yvonne looked straight into the camera lens and accused me of stealing hundreds of thousands of dollars directly from Trent and Gabrielle. She told our family that I was using the stolen money to fuel my dangerous habits and that I was insanely jealous of my sister's perfect marriage. She wept and begged the community to pray for my soul, claiming I was actively trying to destroy Gabrielle's beautiful life out of pure spite. The backlash was instantaneous and brutal. My phone began to overheat as the hateful messages poured in from relatives I had not spoken to in years. My Aunt Clara sent a long paragraph calling me a disgusting monster who did not deserve the air I breathed. My cousin Marcus left 3 furious voicemails demanding I return the money I supposedly stole from Trent. Members of the church congregation flooded my inbox with vicious condemnations, telling me I was an ungrateful child who was breaking my mother's heart. They all believed every single word of her tearful performance. They had always favored Gabrielle, and they were eager to believe that the quiet, analytical sister had finally gone completely crazy. I walked into our secure server room and dropped my phone onto the metal desk. The screen was still lighting up with fresh insults and threats from people sharing my mother's live broadcast. Roxanne spun around in her chair, looking at the hateful messages scrolling across my lock screen. She asked me if I wanted her to block the incoming numbers or shut down my mother's social media accounts. I shook my head and picked up my tablet. I did not want to hide. I did not want to type out a pathetic defense or argue with my delusional relatives in the comment section of a live video. Arguing with a narcissist only gives them the attention they crave. I needed something far more permanent and devastating than a social media argument. I sat down at my workstation and pulled up the encrypted database we had compiled over the last 48 hours. The system contained every single piece of undeniable evidence we had pulled from the Cayman Island servers and the local bank registries. I selected the master mailing list that Roxanne had quietly scraped from my mother's digital address book. The list contained the personal email addresses of every single aunt, uncle, cousin, church elder, and country club associate who was currently watching that live broadcast. I attached the massive file to an untraceable anonymous email address. I did not write a long and emotional message to accompany it. The evidence did not need a dramatic introduction. I simply titled the email "The Truth About the Wilson Family." I looked at Roxanne and gave her a slow nod. I pressed the enter key and hit publish on the scheduled database release. In less than 5 seconds, a massive digital payload was delivered to over 400 people simultaneously. They were receiving the exact documents my mother was desperately trying to hide. The email contained high-resolution scans of Gabrielle's authentic corporate bankruptcy filings, proving her luxury cosmetic boutique was a total financial failure. It included the forged commercial loan documents with my perfectly replicated signature. But the most devastating attachments were Trent's offshore gambling markers. The files detailed his massive 6-figure debts to violent underground syndicates, proving he was a degenerate addict bleeding his own family dry. I leaned back in my chair and watched the live broadcast playing on my phone. My mother was still wiping away her fake tears and asking for prayers. She had absolutely no idea that every single person watching her was about to open an email that would burn her entire world to the ground. The fallout from the database release was absolute and immediate. By Sunday morning, the entire social hierarchy of Atlanta had shifted. My mother Yvonne and my sister Gabrielle were desperately trying to salvage whatever was left of their ruined reputations. They dressed in their most expensive designer outfits and drove to the exclusive Atlanta Country Club for the weekly Sunday brunch. They thought they could simply smile and charm their way out of the massive scandal. The grand dining room of the club was filled with the wealthiest and most influential families in the city. Crystal chandeliers hung from the vaulted ceilings, and waiters in crisp white uniforms carried silver trays of champagne. Yvonne and Gabrielle sat at their usual premium table near the floor-to-ceiling windows. They were surrounded by a group of elite socialites who were clearly whispering about the leaked documents. Yvonne was talking loudly and waving her hands, desperately trying to spin a fabricated story about how our family was the victim of a sophisticated cyber attack. Gabrielle was sitting rigidly beside her, clutching her mimosa and forcing a fake smile as the other women stared at her with barely concealed pity and disgust. I stepped through the heavy oak doors of the dining room wearing a sharp emerald green suit. The chatter in the room instantly died down as people noticed me walking across the plush carpet. I did not rush. I took my time, letting the absolute silence amplify the tension in the room. I walked directly toward the table where my mother and sister were sitting. When Yvonne saw me approaching, her fake smile immediately dissolved into a mask of pure rage. She slammed her champagne glass down onto the white linen tablecloth so hard that the liquid spilled over the rim. She stood up so abruptly that her heavy wooden chair scraped loudly against the floor. She pointed a trembling finger directly at my face and started screaming at the top of her lungs. She demanded to know how I had gotten past the front gates. She yelled that I was a complete disgrace to the family and a criminal who belonged in a federal prison. Her shrill voice echoed across the silent dining room as every single wealthy patron stopped eating and watched the spectacle unfold. Gabrielle grabbed her mother's arm, begging her to sit down and stop making a scene, but Yvonne was completely out of control. She waved frantically at a pair of security guards standing near the entrance. She ordered them to physically remove me from the building immediately, claiming I was a dangerous drug addict who was trespassing on private property. The socialites sitting at the table quickly pushed their chairs back and distanced themselves from my screaming mother. They looked at Yvonne as if she were a lunatic. The heavy double doors of the dining room swung open again, and the general manager of the country club walked briskly into the room. He was a distinguished older man named Harrison, who had run the elite establishment for over 20 years. He was followed closely by the two security guards. Yvonne crossed her arms over her chest and offered me a smug and triumphant smile. She loudly thanked Harrison for arriving so quickly and instructed him to drag me out the back service doors so I would not upset the other wealthy guests any further. Harrison did not even look at my mother. He walked straight past Yvonne and stopped directly in front of me. He completely ignored the furious woman screaming to his left. He offered me a deep and respectful bow. He spoke in a clear and projecting voice that carried across the entirely silent dining room. He welcomed me back to the club and addressed me as Ms. Imani. He politely informed me that as a platinum board member, my private luxury suite was fully prepared and waiting for me upstairs. The entire dining room gasped in collective shock. My mother froze in place, her mouth hanging wide open in sheer disbelief. Her smug smile shattered into a million pieces as her brain struggled to comprehend what was happening. Before she could even stammer out a single word of protest, Harrison slowly turned his attention to her. His warm and respectful demeanor vanished completely. He looked at Yvonne with absolute professional disdain. He informed her in front of every single one of her elite socialite friends that she was no longer welcome on the property. He stated loudly and clearly that her family membership had been permanently revoked due to a long history of bounced checks and severe unpaid dues. Gabrielle buried her face in her hands and let out a loud sob of absolute humiliation. The wealthy women sitting nearby immediately began whispering and laughing behind their hands, pointing directly at my ruined mother. Yvonne looked around the room with wild and terrified eyes, realizing that her darkest financial secrets were now public knowledge. She had tried to have me thrown out like trash, but instead she was the one being publicly evicted from the only social circle she had ever cared about. I returned to my luxury penthouse apartment overlooking the city skyline, feeling a profound sense of closure. The country club confrontation had completely shattered the illusion my mother and sister had spent their entire lives protecting. I was sitting at my kitchen island pouring a glass of sparkling water when the security intercom chimed loudly through the quiet apartment. The concierge informed me that my sister was standing in the lobby crying hysterically and begging to be let upstairs. I glanced at Roxanne, who was already seated at her massive array of monitors in the home office. She gave me a slight nod indicating she had the building's security feeds pulled up. I told the concierge to send Gabrielle up to my floor. I wanted to see exactly how low my sister was willing to sink now that her wealthy facade had been completely destroyed. A few minutes later, my heavy mahogany front door swung open. Gabrielle stumbled into my apartment looking like a complete disaster. Her expensive country club dress was wrinkled, and her mascara was running down her cheeks in thick black streaks. She collapsed onto my velvet sofa, burying her face in her hands and sobbing violently. She told me she had nowhere else to go and that her entire life was falling apart. I stood leaning against the kitchen counter and watched her perform. I did not offer her a tissue or a glass of water. I just waited for the inevitable manipulation to begin. Gabrielle slowly looked up at me with puffy red eyes. She completely turned on her husband without a second of hesitation. She admitted that she knew about the $5,000 a month that was being stolen from my trust fund, but she aggressively claimed that Trent was the mastermind behind all of it. She said Trent had threatened to ruin her if she ever told anyone the truth about the missing money. She played the role of the terrified and helpless wife perfectly. She begged me to forgive her, claiming she was just a victim of his financial abuse and manipulation. Then she finally got to the real reason for her visit. She clasped her hands together and pleaded with me to lend her $50,000 so she could hire a ruthless divorce lawyer. She promised she would leave Trent immediately and help me put him in federal prison if I just gave her the cash to escape his control. She said I was her only hope and that she knew deep down I still loved my big sister. She looked at me with wide, innocent eyes, waiting for me to offer my sympathy and my money. I was about to respond when my smartwatch vibrated silently against my wrist. It was a direct encrypted message from Roxanne, who was still monitoring the building security systems in the next room. Roxanne had run a facial recognition scan on the street-level cameras outside our apartment building. The system had instantly flagged a dark gray sedan parked aggressively close to the alleyway exit. Trent was sitting in the front seat of that car, staring intensely at his laptop screen. But that was not the most disturbing part of the alert. The security software Roxanne used had also accessed the thermal and high-resolution scanners at my front door when Gabrielle walked inside. The message on my watch detailed exactly what the scanners had found. Gabrielle was not here seeking asylum or a divorce lawyer. She was wearing a hidden recording device taped securely beneath the fabric of her expensive dress. She and Trent were working together one last time. They had sent her up here to play the desperate victim, hoping to bait me into saying something incriminating on tape. They desperately needed me to admit to hacking their accounts or extorting them so they could take the recording straight to the authorities and save themselves from prison. I looked away from my watch and stared down at my weeping sister, who was waiting for me to speak directly into her hidden microphone. I stared down at Gabrielle as she continued to sob into her hands. I knew every single word I said was being recorded and transmitted directly to Trent, who was sitting in his dark sedan just down the street. I decided to give them exactly the kind of performance they were desperately hoping for. I let my shoulders drop, and I released a long, heavy sigh to make it sound like my resolve was finally breaking. I walked over to the velvet sofa and sat down right next to my treacherous sister. I leaned in close to her, making sure my voice would be picked up clearly by the hidden microphone taped beneath her designer dress. I told Gabrielle that I believed her, and that I was so sorry she was trapped in such a terrifying situation. She sniffled and grabbed my hands, squeezing them tightly as she played the role of the relieved victim. I lowered my voice to a frantic whisper. I told her that she did not need to hire a divorce lawyer because Trent was not going to be a problem for much longer. I confessed that the corporate audit was actually a massive cover-up, and that I had stolen all the original hard drives containing his illegal gambling ledgers. I lied and said I was terrified of the corporate security teams finding the evidence in my apartment, so I had moved everything completely off-site. Gabrielle stopped crying instantly. Her entire body went rigid as she listened carefully to my fabricated confession. She asked me where the hard drives were hidden, trying to sound like a concerned sister who wanted to protect me. I told her I had rented a secure storage locker at the downtown Central train station. I specifically mentioned locker number 412 in the South Terminal. I said the master files were sitting right there in a black duffel bag, and I was planning to hand them over to the federal authorities the very next morning. I told her that once those drives were handed over, Trent would be gone forever, and she would finally be free. Gabrielle stood up so fast, she nearly tripped over her own expensive heels. She wiped her face and told me she needed to go home immediately to pack her bags before Trent realized she was missing. She threw her arms around me and thanked me for saving her life. It took every ounce of self-control I possessed not to push her away. I simply nodded and walked her to the front door. The second the heavy mahogany door clicked shut behind her, I turned and walked straight into the server room. Roxanne was grinning from ear to ear. She tapped the main monitor showing the street-level security feed. We watched Gabrielle sprint out of the building and run straight down the dark alleyway toward the waiting gray sedan. The passenger door swung open and she jumped inside. The car immediately sped off into the night, heading directly toward the downtown Central train station. They had taken the bait hook, line, and sinker. Across town, the Central train station was practically deserted at this hour of the night. The harsh fluorescent lights buzzed softly overhead as Trent ran through the South Terminal. He was sprinting past the empty ticket counters with a heavy steel crowbar clutched in his sweating hands. His heart was hammering against his ribs, but a sick sense of victory was already washing over him. He truly believed he had outsmarted me. He thought he was minutes away from destroying the only physical evidence that could send him to federal prison. He found the bank of gray metal storage lockers against the far wall of the terminal. He quickly scanned the painted numbers until his eyes locked onto locker 412. Trent did not even hesitate. He jammed the sharp end of the crowbar into the lock mechanism and threw his entire body weight against the heavy steel tool. The cheap metal latch snapped with a loud, echoing crack. The locker door swung open. Trent dropped the crowbar and reached inside, expecting to grab a black duffel bag filled with stolen hard drives. But the locker was completely empty. There were no hard drives, and there were no corporate ledgers. The only thing sitting inside the dark metal cube was a small square mirror propped up against the back wall. Trent leaned forward, panting heavily, as he stared at his own terrified reflection in the glass. Stuck directly to the center of the mirror was a bright yellow sticky note with a message written in bold black ink. The note simply said, "Look behind you." A cold, paralyzing dread washed over Trent. The triumphant smirk melted off his face as the heavy sound of combat boots echoed across the terminal floor. Trent slowly turned around, his hands trembling wildly at his sides. Standing completely silently in a wide semicircle behind him were 12 agents from the Federal Bureau of Investigation. They were wearing tactical vests and holding their weapons at the ready. The lead agent stepped forward with a pair of heavy steel handcuffs shining in the fluorescent light. He told Trent he was under arrest for corporate embezzlement, wire fraud, and the attempted destruction of federal evidence. Trent collapsed to his knees on the cold tile floor, finally realizing the game was over. Trent was dragged out of the central train station in heavy steel handcuffs, but his terrifying stay in federal custody did not last very long. He was allowed one single phone call, and he certainly did not use it to contact my sister Gabrielle. He knew she had failed her mission with the wire, and he knew she was useless to him now. Instead, he called his wealthy white parents, who lived in a massive gated estate in Connecticut. His family had spent their entire lives using their vast wealth to buy their way out of consequences, and they were absolutely not going to let their precious son sit in a dirty jail cell. His parents were outraged that anyone would dare arrest him, and they immediately contacted their elite legal team. Within hours, his father had wired a massive amount of money to post his exorbitant bail. Trent walked out of the federal building before the sun even came up. The cold morning air hit his face as he stood on the concrete steps, but the freedom felt completely hollow. He knew the severe federal charges were still hanging heavily over his head. The encrypted database I had released to his entire social circle was completely undeniable, and the feds had confiscated his laptop. He was a desperate animal backed into a corner, and he urgently needed a scapegoat to take the fall. Trent did not go back to his luxury downtown condo. He knew my auditing team was likely watching his every single move, and he figured federal agents might be waiting there with another search warrant. Instead, he got into his dark sedan and drove erratically toward the affluent suburbs. He was heading straight for the sprawling Wilson family estate to find my father, Desmond. My father had been the one who originally welcomed Trent into the family with open arms. Desmond had always favored Trent because he was exactly the kind of wealthy, well-connected son-in-law he had always wanted to show off to his elite country club friends. My father had quietly enabled Trent's reckless financial behavior for years just to maintain the perfect illusion of my sister's highly successful marriage. Trent pulled up to my parents' dark estate and bypassed the heavy wooden front doors entirely. He slipped through the side garden gate and stomped across the manicured lawn. He pounded heavily on the glass patio doors until my father finally stumbled out of the shadows to open them. Desmond was wearing a silk bathrobe and holding a half-empty glass of expensive bourbon. He looked completely exhausted and defeated from the massive public humiliation Yvonne had dragged him into at the country club earlier that afternoon. When he saw Trent standing on his patio, looking like a deranged and panicked fugitive, his face went completely pale. Trent did not wait for an invitation. He violently shoved his way inside the dark living room and backed my elderly father up against the expensive leather sofa. The heavy glass door slammed shut behind them. A vicious and terrifying argument broke out instantly. Trent was sweating profusely, and his eyes were wild with absolute panic. He grabbed the lapels of my father's silk robe and shook him violently. He pointed a shaking finger directly at Desmond and demanded that my father take the complete fall for the forged commercial loan signatures. Desmond gasped for air and tried to push the younger man away. He stammered and protested, claiming he had absolutely no idea the business loans were forged or that the boutique was bankrupt. But Trent cut him off with a loud and vicious laugh that echoed through the empty living room. Trent aggressively reminded my father that it was Desmond who had handed over my personal identification documents in the first place. Years ago, my father had given Trent access to my old tax returns and bank statements under the guise of helping me manage my finances. Trent leaned in so close that my father could smell the stale coffee and pure fear on his breath. He threatened to march straight back to the federal authorities and tell them that my father was the actual criminal mastermind behind the entire embezzlement scheme. He said he would testify that Desmond had orchestrated the forgery to steal money from his own daughter. Trent told Desmond that if he was going to go down for federal wire fraud, he was going to drag the entire Wilson family down to the bottom of the ocean right alongside him. My father was trembling with absolute terror. He suddenly realized that the charming and wealthy monster he had eagerly welcomed into his home was now threatening to completely destroy his freedom and put him behind bars. Trent did not give him a moment to think. He demanded that my father give him enough untraceable cash to flee the country immediately. He knew Desmond always kept a massive reserve of emergency cash in the house. He ordered my father to empty his safe before the feds could officially freeze his passport and trap him in the city. Desmond nodded frantically, spilling his bourbon on the expensive rug as he scrambled to comply. He walked quickly down the dark hallway toward his private home office, with Trent following closely behind him like a shadow. My father walked over to a large oil painting hanging on the oak-paneled wall and swung it outward on its hidden hinges. He revealed a heavy steel wall safe embedded directly into the reinforced concrete. Desmond frantically spun the combination dial, his hands shaking so badly that he had to try 3 separate times just to get the numbers aligned correctly. He told Trent he had hundreds of thousands of dollars in unmarked $100 bills hidden inside. He practically begged Trent to take every single dollar and just leave the property before he ruined their lives any further. The heavy metal door of the safe clicked loudly and swung open. Desmond reached his trembling hands inside, expecting to grab the thick stacks of banded currency. But his hands found absolutely nothing. He gasped and pulled the steel door wider so the dim light from the hallway could illuminate the inside of the dark metal box. The emergency cash was completely gone. Every single shelf was entirely empty. The massive fortune my father had been hoarding for emergencies had vanished into thin air. The only thing left sitting inside the massive steel safe was a single item resting perfectly in the absolute center of the bottom shelf. It was a solid black wooden chess piece, specifically a knight. My father stared at the small carved wooden horse in complete and utter terror. His knees went weak as he realized that I had already been inside his most secure sanctuary. Trent stared over his shoulder at the empty safe and let out a strangled cry of pure despair. They both finally understood that I had always been 10 steps ahead of them, and their entire world was now completely under my control. The digital map on Roxanne's monitor blinked as we tracked Trent's erratic movements away from my parents' estate. I leaned back in my ergonomic chair and took a slow sip of my coffee. The heavy security doors to my private server room hissed open, and the room was suddenly filled with the scent of expensive cigars and peppermint. My grandfather Elias walked through the doorway, looking sharper and more dangerous than he had in a decade. He had permanently relocated to Atlanta, and he looked like a general ready to survey a conquered battlefield. He walked over to my desk and dropped a heavy canvas duffel bag onto the metal surface. The bag unzipped slightly, and thick banded stacks of unmarked $100 bills spilled out under the harsh fluorescent lights. Elias offered me a slow and satisfied smile. He explained that emptying Desmond's hidden wall safe had been the easiest tactical maneuver of his entire life. My father was so predictable and so arrogant that he had never bothered to change the factory combination on the safe Elias had installed for him 20 years ago. My grandfather knew exactly where the physical backup keys were hidden, and he simply walked into the house while Desmond and Yvonne were distracted by their own public humiliation at the country club. Elias walked around my workstation and proudly admitted that leaving the Black Knight chess piece was his personal finishing touch. He wanted Desmond to know exactly who had outsmarted him. My grandfather placed a heavy hand on my shoulder and looked at the glowing screens displaying my family members' crumbling financial empires. He gave me a firm nod and told me it was time to initiate the final phase of our operation. The trapped animals had nowhere left to run, and it was time to close the cage completely. I turned back to my keyboard and cracked my knuckles. Roxanne pulled up the master control program we had meticulously coded over the past few days. The forensic data I had gathered from the Cayman Island servers and the forged local bank registries gave us complete backdoor access to every single financial institution my family used. We had documented every single illegal wire transfer and every forged signature. I started running the execution scripts one by one. First, I targeted Trent's emergency offshore accounts. These were the shadow accounts his wealthy parents had quickly established to hide his remaining assets after paying his federal bail. I initiated a massive digital lock using the federal fraud alerts we had legally generated through the corporate audit. Within seconds, his balances dropped to absolute zero, and his accounts were permanently frozen under suspected international money laundering protocols. The system alerted the local banks that the funds were connected to an active federal investigation. Next, I moved on to my parents. Desmond and Yvonne had spent decades building a house of cards on credit and false prestige. I accessed the private banking portals holding their retirement funds and their primary checking accounts. I triggered the automated embezzlement flags using the forged commercial loan documents they had helped Gabrielle secure. The security protocols worked exactly as intended. The system immediately locked them out of every single liquid asset they possessed. Their black titanium credit cards were instantly deactivated. Their emergency lines of credit were completely severed. They were officially broke. Finally, I brought down Gabrielle's personal accounts. The boutique funds were already seized by the bankruptcy courts, but she had been secretly hoarding money in a private trust she set up behind Trent's back. She thought she was clever hiding her stolen cash in a dummy corporation under a fake name. I shattered the firewall protecting her secret fund and linked it directly to the same federal fraud investigation tracking Trent. The digital padlock slammed shut. In less than 4 minutes, my entire treacherous family had been stripped of every single dollar they owned. They could not buy a gallon of gas or a plane ticket to flee the city. Roxanne clapped her hands together and cheered quietly as the red-locked icons multiplied across our monitoring screens. My grandfather pulled a sleek black smartphone from his tailored suit jacket. He looked down at the screen and typed out a single message. He connected the phone to our automated broadcasting system so the text would be delivered simultaneously to the 4 people who had tried to destroy my life. Across the city, 4 separate cell phones vibrated at the exact same moment. Yvonne was weeping in her luxury bedroom after being thrown out of the country club. Desmond was staring in horror at his empty wall safe and the black chess piece. Gabrielle was hiding in a cheap motel room, terrified of both Trent and the authorities. Trent was sitting in his car, gripping the steering wheel in pure panic as his parents' money vanished from his phone screen. They all looked down at their glowing devices and read the exact same message from Elias. The text was cold and absolute. It demanded a mandatory family meeting at the main estate at 8 o'clock tonight. The message clearly stated that their attendance was strictly required if they wanted to avoid immediate federal prison time. I watched the delivery receipts on my monitor confirm that every single one of them had read the message. The final showdown was set, and they had absolutely no choice but to walk right into the lion's den. The iron gates of my grandfather's massive Atlanta estate slowly swung open precisely at 7:55. The long, winding driveway was lined with ancient oak trees, casting long, dark shadows across the pristine pavement. Through the high-definition security cameras, my grandfather and I watched the 2 vehicles arrive. Desmond and Yvonne pulled up in their leased luxury SUV, which was now technically a stolen vehicle, since the automatic lease payments would inevitably bounce tomorrow morning. Trent and Gabrielle arrived moments later in his dark sedan. They all climbed out of their cars and gathered on the grand circular driveway. Even through the grainy night vision camera feed, I could see their absolute terror mixed perfectly with their usual sickening arrogance. My mother smoothed down her designer dress and adjusted her posture, trying to project an air of superiority. My father puffed out his chest, trying to look like the wealthy patriarch he no longer was. Gabrielle was shivering in the night air, wrapping her expensive coat tightly around her shoulders, while Trent frantically paced back and forth, wiping nervous sweat from his forehead. They were a miserable collection of desperate criminals, but they genuinely believed they could just walk right into this house and manipulate the old man one last time. They thought they could flash a few charming smiles, shed a few fake tears, and beg for another massive financial bailout to make all their little legal problems completely disappear. The heavy double front doors were intentionally left unlocked for them. They pushed their way inside the grand foyer without even bothering to knock, acting like they still owned the entire world. Their footsteps echoed loudly on the imported marble floors as they marched directly down the long corridor toward my grandfather's private study. They walked past towering portraits of our ancestors and heavy velvet drapes drawn tight against the night sky. They expected to find an elderly and out-of-touch man sitting alone at his desk, waiting to be swindled by his favorite child and his golden grandchildren. Instead, they walked into the grand study and found me. I was sitting perfectly still right behind the massive mahogany desk. I was leaning back comfortably in my grandfather's high-backed leather chair, resting my hands flat on the polished wood. The room was dimly lit by a single antique brass lamp, casting a warm golden glow across my face. The air in the room was thick with the scent of old paper and expensive leather. A profound sense of absolute peace washed over me as I watched them filter into the room one by one. The sweet taste of victory was finally here, after years of being treated like a second-class citizen in my own family. The four of them stopped dead in their tracks the second they saw me. All the color drained instantly from Gabrielle's face. Her jaw dropped open, and she took a stumbling step backward, bumping right into her husband. Trent looked like he was going to be physically sick right there on the expensive Persian rug. He knew the federal agents were closing in, and he knew his offshore accounts were completely drained. Seeing me sitting behind that desk confirmed his absolute worst fears. Desmond stared at me in pure shock, his mind unable to comprehend how the daughter he had treated like garbage for decades had beaten them to the estate. My mother Yvonne was the first one to finally find her voice, and naturally she chose to use it to attack me. Her face contorted with absolute fury as she pointed a shaking, manicured finger directly in my direction. She completely ignored the incredibly obvious fact that they were all facing federal prison sentences and decided to focus entirely on her own inflated ego and her desperate need to control me. She actually believed Elias had called them there to protect the family name, and she thought my presence was a mistake. She marched forward, her expensive heels clicking aggressively against the hardwood floor. She demanded to know what I was doing in the house and how I had gotten past the security gate. She glared at me with pure venom and aggressively commanded me to get out of the patriarch's seat immediately. She screamed that I was disrespecting the head of the family and that I had absolutely no right to sit at that desk. She told me I was nothing but a jealous failure who was trying to insert myself into a private family crisis that did not concern me. She did not even get the chance to finish her bitter, delusional sentence. A heavy set of double doors hidden in the deep shadows of the library swung open with a soft and deliberate click. The sound cut through my mother's shrill voice like a sharp blade. My grandfather Elias stepped quietly out of the darkness and into the dim light of the study. The room went dead silent. Nobody dared to breathe. Elias walked slowly around the edge of the massive desk, his presence dominating the entire room. He did not look at my parents or my sister. He did not even acknowledge the panicked criminal standing by the doorway. He stopped right beside my chair and placed a heavy protective hand firmly on my shoulder. The weight of his hand was a physical manifestation of his complete support and ultimate authority. Elias finally looked up and stared directly at my mother with eyes as cold as absolute ice. His voice was low and calm, but it carried a terrifying weight that paralyzed everyone in the room. He told her that she was completely wrong. He told her that I was not disrespecting anyone and I was exactly where I was supposed to be. He squeezed my shoulder gently and looked at the four terrified faces staring back at him. He told them that she sits there because she is the new head of this family. The silence that followed my grandfather's declaration was so heavy, it felt like it could crush the breath right out of their lungs. My mother Yvonne staggered backward as if she had been physically struck by the words. The absolute reality of her defeat was finally settling into her arrogant mind, and the horror on her face was deeply satisfying to watch. Desmond looked between me and his father, his mouth opening and closing wordlessly, like a fish suffocating on dry land. They had spent their entire lives treating me like I was completely invisible, and now I was the undeniable master of their fate. Suddenly, the fragile facade of their perfect upper-class unity completely shattered into a million pieces. The moment they realized they were all trapped in an inescapable federal net, the wealthy and refined Wilson family turned into a pack of starving wolves. They were just cornered rats, desperate to save their own skin. And the inevitable betrayal started exactly where I expected it to. Trent pointed a trembling, sweating finger at his wife Gabrielle. His handsome face was twisted with pure panic and a vicious, ugly rage. He loudly declared to the room that he had absolutely nothing to do with the missing funds from the commercial loan. He threw his own wife directly under the bus, screaming that Gabrielle had siphoned the stolen capital to fuel her insane shopping addiction. He told the room that she never spent a single dime of that loan on her failing boutique. Instead, she had wasted hundreds of thousands of stolen dollars on rare Birkin bags, designer shoes, and luxury European vacations just to impress her shallow socialite friends. He yelled that she was a greedy parasite and he was just an innocent victim of her relentless spending habits. Gabrielle shrieked in absolute horror and slapped Trent's hand away from her face. She began sobbing hysterically, calling him a pathetic liar and a coward. But the chaotic chain reaction of betrayal had already been ignited and the fire was spreading fast. My mother Yvonne desperately spun around and fiercely attacked my father. She completely abandoned her devoted, supportive wife routine and blamed Desmond for everything that had gone wrong. She screamed that he was the one stupid enough to forge the banking signatures and hand over my identity documents in the first place. She told my grandfather that Desmond had orchestrated the entire fraud because he was too weak and too incompetent to admit his real estate investments were failing miserably. She claimed she was just a helpless wife who trusted her husband to manage their finances. Desmond refused to take the fall alone. His face flushed a dangerous shade of bright red as he violently fired back at the woman he had been married to for decades. He yelled that he only forged the documents because Yvonne had spent years driving them into complete financial ruin. He screamed that her desperate, pathetic obsession with impressing Trent's elite Connecticut family had utterly bankrupted them. She had mercilessly forced him to buy the luxury cars, upgrade the expensive country club memberships, and host lavish catered parties they could not afford just to keep up the pathetic illusion of their massive wealth. He told her she was a shallow narcissist and that he committed federal crimes just to keep her from throwing a tantrum. The grand study devolved into a deafening war zone. They were all screaming at the top of their lungs, tearing each other to pieces right in front of my desk. Accusations and bitter insults flew across the room as decades of hidden resentment boiled over. None of them took even a fraction of accountability for their own monstrous actions. They were entirely consumed by their own selfish desire to escape the consequences of their crimes. They clawed at each other's throats, desperately trying to survive the sinking ship they had built together. My grandfather Elias stood silently beside me, watching his own bloodline tear itself apart, with an expression of pure, unadulterated disgust. I sat perfectly still in the leather chair and let them scream until their voices went hoarse. I let them exhaust themselves until the study echoed with nothing but their heavy panting and pathetic sobbing. When the room finally fell quiet enough to hear a pin drop, I slowly opened the top drawer of the heavy mahogany desk. The soft slide of the wood was enough to make them all freeze and look at me with wide, terrified eyes. I pulled out a single, thick legal document printed on crisp white paper. I placed my hand flat on top of it and slowly slid it across the smooth surface of the desk toward the front edge where they stood. It was a legally binding federal confession contract, fully drafted by my elite auditing team in total cooperation with the federal prosecutors. I looked at the four terrified faces staring back at me, and I let a cold, calculating smile touch my lips. I told them that my legal team had spent the afternoon negotiating, and we had secured exactly one federal plea deal from the prosecutor. I kept my voice completely flat and devoid of any emotion as I explained the terms. Whoever signs this document, taking full and complete responsibility for the embezzlement and the wire fraud, will get a reduced sentence and a comfortable security arrangement. The rest of you will go to trial and receive the absolute maximum sentence in a maximum security federal prison. The collective gasp in the room was like music to my ears. I reached into my suit pocket and pulled out a sleek silver fountain pen. I placed it gently on the desk right next to the confession contract. The heavy silver metal gleamed under the warm light of the antique brass lamp. I looked directly into their panicked, desperate eyes and told them the undeniable truth. There is only one pen. The single silver fountain pen sat on the polished mahogany desk, gleaming under the warm lamplight like a loaded weapon. For a split second, nobody moved. The four of them just stared at the pen, and then they slowly turned to look at each other. The last remaining shreds of their wealthy, refined family image completely evaporated into the heavy air of the study. They were no longer a country club family bound by blood and status. They were feral animals trapped in a cage, and I had just thrown a single piece of meat into the very center of it. Trent was the first to break. He let out a guttural, desperate sound and lunged across the expensive Persian rug toward the desk. His eyes were wild with pure survival instinct. He stretched his trembling hand out to grab the silver pen. But Gabrielle was faster. My sister shrieked and threw her entire body weight against her husband, grabbing his arm and violently pulling him backward. She screamed that she was too young and too beautiful to spend her life in a federal prison cell because of his pathetic gambling debts. She clawed at his tailored suit jacket, desperately trying to reach the desk before him. Trent lost his mind completely. His face contorted into a mask of pure, unhinged rage. He ripped his arm out of her grasp and swung his body around, shoving Gabrielle with all of his strength. My sister flew backward and crashed hard onto the hardwood floor, her expensive coat tangling around her legs as she hit the ground with a loud thud. She gasped for air and began sobbing hysterically, clutching her bruised shoulder. But Trent did not even look back at her. He scrambled toward the desk, panting like a cornered beast. Desmond saw his opportunity and charged forward. My elderly father pushed past Trent, trying to snatch the pen right out from under his fingers. Desmond yelled that he was the patriarch of the Wilson family, and he deserved the plea deal because he was the only one with a real reputation to protect. Yvonne was right behind him, screaming at the top of her lungs that she was the one who deserved immunity because she never signed any of the commercial loan documents herself. They were all frantically shouting their own explicit admissions of guilt directly into the open air of the study. Trent screamed that my father forged the bank registries while Desmond yelled that Yvonne forced him to do it to impress Trent's family. Yvonne shrieked that Desmond was a failure and Trent was a fraud. None of them took an ounce of accountability. They just blamed each other, tearing their family apart to save themselves. My grandfather Elias stood beside me, watching the absolute physical chaos unfold with cold, detached disgust. He placed his hand on my shoulder and gave it a firm, approving squeeze. They were fighting like starving dogs over a silver pen that meant absolutely nothing. The confession contract, sitting on the desk, was just a piece of standard boilerplate paper I had printed out an hour ago. There was no negotiated plea deal from the federal prosecutor. There was no immunity agreement. The entire room was wired with hidden high-definition microphones recording every single panicked confession and every vicious accusation they hurled at each other. They had just handed the federal authorities an airtight, neatly wrapped conviction on a silver platter. Trent finally managed to shove my father aside, and his sweaty fingers wrapped tightly around the cold silver barrel of the pen. He let out a breathless laugh of pure triumphant relief and slammed the pen down onto the fake contract, ready to sign his name and secure his freedom. Before the ink could even touch the paper, the heavy double doors of the grand study burst open with a deafening crash. A dozen heavily armed federal agents flooded into the room. They were wearing dark tactical gear and gripping their weapons tightly as they fanned out across the grand study. The lead agent was a tall, sharp-eyed man that Roxanne had been coordinating with for weeks. He barked sharp, authoritative commands, ordering everyone to put their hands in the air and step entirely away from the desk. Trent froze in absolute shock. The silver pen slipped from his trembling fingers and clattered onto the desk. His arrogant, triumphant smirk completely dissolved into an expression of profound, paralyzing terror. He looked from the armed agents to the blank piece of paper on the desk, and then finally, he looked directly at me. The crushing realization washed over his face as he finally understood that he had been completely outsmarted. The plea deal was a psychological trap, and he had walked right into it, dragging everyone else down with him. Federal agents moved in swiftly and ruthlessly. They grabbed Trent by the arms and violently twisted him around, snapping heavy steel handcuffs securely around his wrists. Trent completely lost what was left of his sanity. He began thrashing and screaming at the top of his lungs, begging the agents to look at the contract, claiming he was trying to cooperate. The lead agent simply ignored his pathetic cries and aggressively dragged him toward the open doors. Trent's voice echoed down the long marble corridor as he was hauled out of the estate, crying like a terrified child. Two agents approached my father. Desmond did not even try to fight them. All the fight had drained completely out of his body, leaving behind nothing but an exhausted, broken old man. He held his trembling hands out and allowed the agents to cuff him. His eyes were vacant and glassy as he stared down at his expensive shoes, while the agents read him his rights. Gabrielle was still weeping hysterically on the floor. An agent gently pulled her to her feet and placed her in handcuffs while she sobbed about her ruined life and her ruined marriage. She looked incredibly small and pathetic as they escorted her out of the room. That left only my mother. Yvonne was backed up against the heavy velvet drapes, her chest heaving as she stared at the federal agents closing in on her. The steel cuffs clicked loudly as they were locked around her wrists. Her perfect designer world had entirely collapsed, and she had absolutely nothing left but her deeply ingrained manipulation tactics. She looked past the agents and locked her tear-filled eyes directly onto mine. Her makeup was running down her cheeks, and her face was twisted in a mask of desperate maternal entitlement. She leaned forward, and her voice cracked with theatrical anguish. She wept and told me that she was my mother and that I was supposed to forgive her. I sat perfectly still in my grandfather's leather chair, resting my hands on the polished mahogany desk. I looked at the woman who had spent my entire life making me feel completely worthless. I looked at the mother who had gladly watched her golden child and her golden son-in-law try to send me to a federal prison just to protect their country club memberships. I felt absolutely no anger and no sadness. I only felt a profound sense of closure. I looked directly into her desperate weeping eyes, and I kept my voice perfectly flat and cold. I told her that I forgave her the exact moment I stopped needing her. I told her that this was not revenge, this was just the bill arriving. My mother let out a strangled, helpless sob as the federal agents firmly turned her around and marched her out of the grand study. The heavy doors closed quietly behind them, leaving the room in absolute silence. My grandfather Elias looked down at me and smiled a genuine proud smile. The toxic rot that had infected our family for decades had finally been surgically removed. The storm was completely over, and for the first time in my life, the future belonged entirely to me. The heavy oak doors of the grand study had clicked shut, sealing the fate of the people who had spent my entire life trying to destroy me. That single quiet sound echoed in my mind for weeks as the federal justice system meticulously dismantled what was left of their pathetic lives. 3 months later, I stood in the center of my pristine corner office on the 40th floor of the downtown high-rise that now served as the official headquarters for my artificial intelligence firm. The floor-to-ceiling glass windows offered an unobstructed panoramic view of the Atlanta skyline. The morning sun poured across the sleek white marble floors and illuminated the massive digital monitors displaying my company's skyrocketing market valuation. I leaned against the polished glass and took a slow sip of my coffee while the local morning news played softly on the flat-screen television mounted on the far wall. The news anchor looked somber as she reported the final sentencing in the high-profile corporate fraud case that had absolutely captivated the city. The screen flashed a courtroom sketch of Trent looking gaunt and terrified in a bright orange federal jumpsuit. The judge had shown absolutely no mercy. Trent was officially handed a mandatory 10-year sentence in a maximum security federal penitentiary without the possibility of early parole. His desperate attempts to cooperate after his arrest were completely useless because the hot mic recordings had already given the prosecutors every single piece of evidence they needed. His wealthy parents had tried to use their political connections to save him, but the sheer volume of his international money laundering and wire fraud charges made him entirely radioactive. The news segment quickly transitioned to my parents. Desmond and Yvonne had avoided prison time by liquidating every single asset they possessed to pay massive federal fines, but their public humiliation was an entirely different kind of life sentence. The broadcast showed footage of federal marshals physically seizing their massive Connecticut estate. The sprawling mansion that had been the ultimate symbol of my mother's desperate social climbing was auctioned off to the highest bidder to cover their remaining debts. They were officially bankrupt, disgraced, and permanently exiled from the wealthy elite circles they had worshipped their entire lives. As for my sister Gabrielle, the reality of her new life was almost too perfect to believe. The bankruptcy courts had seized her failing boutique and frozen her secret trust fund to pay back the commercial loans she and Desmond had fraudulently secured. She was legally ordered to pay thousands of dollars in monthly restitution. Roxanne had recently sent me a blurry photograph she took at a discount retail store on the edge of the city. It showed Gabrielle wearing a cheap polyester uniform with a plastic name tag pinned to her chest. She was ringing up discount clothing at a cash register, looking utterly miserable and exhausted. She was working a grueling minimum wage retail job just to survive and pay back the money she had stolen from me. There were no more European vacations and no more designer bags. She was finally experiencing the real world that she had always believed she was entirely too good for. I turned off the television with a soft click of the remote, just as the heavy glass doors to my office slid open. My grandfather Elias walked in looking incredibly sharp in a tailored charcoal suit. He held a thick leather portfolio under his arm, and his eyes crinkled with genuine pride as he looked around my massive office space. He walked over to my desk and placed the heavy leather portfolio down on the smooth glass surface. He unclasped the metal lock and slid a thick stack of legal documents toward me. I looked down and saw the official deeds to his entire commercial real estate empire. He had spent the last 3 months working with his legal team to legally transfer every single building, every investment portfolio, and every holding company directly into my name. He told me that he was officially retiring, and that there was nobody else in the world he trusted to protect and grow the legacy he had built from nothing. He placed his weathered hands over mine and told me that I had proven my strength, my brilliance, and my absolute loyalty. The empire was finally in the hands of the only person who actually deserved it. The true magnitude of my victory did not fully hit me until the end of November. I decided to host a massive Thanksgiving dinner at my new luxury penthouse overlooking the city. The massive dining table was decorated with fresh autumn flowers and tall white candles casting a warm, beautiful glow across the room. The air was filled with the incredible scent of roasted turkey and rich spices. But the most beautiful part of the evening was the people sitting around the table. This was not the toxic, suffocating family dinners of my past. There was no passive-aggressive insults, no desperate social climbing, and no cruel comparisons. The table was filled with my chosen family. Roxanne sat near the head of the table laughing loudly as she shared a story with my lead developers. My dedicated colleagues and the brilliant engineers who had helped me build my company from the ground up were passing plates of food and smiling genuinely. My grandfather Elias sat right beside me, holding a glass of expensive red wine and looking happier and more at peace than I had ever seen him. I stood up from my chair and picked up my wine glass. The conversations around the table slowly faded into a comfortable, happy silence as everyone turned to look at me. I looked at Roxanne's beaming face and my grandfather's proud smile. I thought about the terrified, lonely girl I used to be, desperate for the approval of people who were completely incapable of love. That girl was gone forever. She had been replaced by a woman who had built her own empire from the ashes of their betrayal. I raised my glass to the ceiling, the dark red wine catching the light from the chandeliers. I was surrounded by people who respected my mind, who valued my friendship, and who loved me completely unconditionally. My toxic past had been entirely erased, and my future was a wide open sky. I took a slow, satisfying sip of my wine, feeling completely whole, completely powerful, and entirely untouchable. The greatest lesson I learned from this entire ordeal is that blood does not automatically make someone family. True family is built on a foundation of mutual respect, unwavering support, and genuine love. You are never obligated to endure toxic behavior or emotional manipulation just because you share a last name with your abusers. Sometimes the bravest and most necessary thing you can do is walk away and build your own table with people who actually value your worth. Tell us your own story of reclaiming your power in the comments below, and subscribe to hear more journeys of survival and success.